Hello guys, it's Henry here. In this video, I would like to share with you how you can create a simple CRUD application using the Angular framework and Google's Firebase for the backend. So we'll be creating a simple application that allows us to add the names of players, and we can edit and also delete these players. So let me show you a quick demo of what the application looks like. So I'm running the application right here on my local machine. As you can see, it's running on localhost port 4200. That's the default port for Angular application. And we have this Bootstrap navigation right here on the application. So we are using Angular as well as Bootstrap to style the front end of the application. We have two links right here. The first link allows us to see the players that have been added to our application. Currently there are no players that are added. That's why he shows this message that there's no player in the system. So we can go to the next link where we have this nice Bootstrap form that would allow us to enter new data for the player. So we've also implemented validation on this form. So if I click on the input field and I try to leave the field without entering data to the form, you see I get this message that says the name of the field it's required. So I'm styling this message using the Bootstrap. There is an invalidate feedback class from Bootstrap that allows me to style this class. We'll be looking at that, how to um, do validation with Angular. And the same thing for the other fields as well. If I try to click on them without entering value into the field, we get this error message. And same thing for the age. And also, if I try to save this form, when the form is invalid, I get an error message that the form is invalid. There are some errors with the form. And this message right here, I'm using Angular Flash message to display the message with the application. So we'll be learning a bit when building this application. We'll be learning how to use Bootstrap to style a form, Angular Flash message, and we'll be learning how to save the form and add functionality to the form. So let's enter a valid data to the form and see how it works. So let's say I want to enter my first football player, which is Frank Lampard, and his country is England, and his age is, let's say, 43. And if I hit save, you see the Angular Flash message showing me the player has been added, and I see the player being displayed here with a Bootstrap table right here. So I can also add another player. Let's say I had Akim Ziyech, and his country, he's from Morocco, and his age is, let's say, 29. I can save that, and you see we get the Angular Flash message that shows the player has been added, and it get added to our list. So it's just a simple application right here. We can add player, we can view the players that we've added, and we can also delete. So if I say I want to, let's do the edit first. So if I want to change the age of this player is 29, and I want to increase it to 30, and click on save, you see player has been updated, our flash message there, and you see that the age of the player has been updated. And also we can do the delete. If I click on the edit, you see we have this delete button right here, and if we want to delete this player, you just click delete, you get the JavaScript confirmation box here, and if I click OK, you see that that player has been deleted. So it's a simple CRUD application that allows us to create, so add a new player, to read, that's view all the players that we have in the system, to update, so to edit the player that we've added, and also we have the delete functionality. Now we can also see these players that we've added in our backend, which is Google Firebase. So if I go to firebase.google.com, and I go to the console by logging into the account that I'm using, and here you want to click on get started, and you want to go into your project. In this application, I'll be using the Firestore database but you also have the real-time database, and you can see that we have our player collection here. You have the ID and you have the document right here. So that's it, guys. That's this application that I'll be building. I hope you would learn a lot when building this application with me, and I hope you enjoy the video. So guys, the first thing we want to do when setting up our application is creating the database and a Firebase project for the application. So what you need to be able to do this is just a Gmail account, and you can head over to your Firebase console and create the project. So let's quickly see how we can do that. First, you want to head over to firebase.google.com, and then you go over to the right hand side where you have this go to console, and then you want to sign in with your Gmail account. So it brings you to this page, and you want to hit on this get started, and from here you can create a new project. So you want to click on create a project, and you want to enter a name for your project. I'm going to call mine players app, because we'll be adding the names of our players to the database, and you want to hit continue, and then you want to hit continue on this. You want to select the default account for Firebase, and you want to hit create project. So it's going to take some time to create the project, and you're going to see all the options that you are able to set in your project. Firebase has quite a few options. That's really cool because you get these options for free. You can set up authentication, you can set up the Firestore database, and you can also set up the real-time database, which is really cool. And you can get hosting as well for free. So that's a lot for free cloud services. All right, so our players app is ready. We want to hit on continue. And like I said, you can see all the options we have. We have authentication, Firestore, real-time database, hosting, a lot of options that we have we can set up in Firebase. But for now, we just want to set up our Firestore database. So you want to click on Firestore. And right here, you want to create database. You have two modes where you can create the database, either in production or in test mode. We're just creating a simple application, so we're going to do it on test mode. And you want to hit next. You want to choose the region that's closest to you. I'll be using Europe West, and then you want to enable that. So Firebase is going to provision all you need to create the database, and Firestore database is very similar to MongoDB, which is a NoSQL database that allows you to save documents in collection. Now you have to think about the document and collection like your file system. So you have a folder that you can use to save files. So your collection is acting like your folder, and you have the different documents in the collection acting like the files. So let's create one, and you're gonna see how it works. So you want to click on start collection, and the collection ID let's call it players, because we'll be storing the names of players, like I said. Let's hit next, and here you want to add in the document that you want to save in the players collection. So you can generate the ID, and let's give some field name here. I'm going to say first name, and for value let's use Frank. I'll add another field, and let's give it last name. For value, let's say Lampard, and another field, country, let's say England. And finally, let's add one more, and let's call it age. But this time we'll give it a different data type. Now for the document, you have different data types that you can use. You can use string, you can use number, boolean, arrays, and timestamp. But the common one, you can mostly use string, number, and boolean. I think it's good for whatever you're doing. So let's just use number for age, so we have a different data type, and let's give him 43. So we'll save our first document right there. Let's add another document. You can generate the ID for the field. We're going to say the same thing, first name, and for value, let's say Akim. Last name, let's say Ziyach, and for country, let's say Morocco, for the age, the data type we were using is number, and let's say he's 27. Okay, so we have these two documents right here in our collection. So that's how easy it is to set up a database on Firebase, guys. It's really easy. Now, the next thing I want to show you guys is how we can generate our Angular project. Since we've set up the database, let's also set up the Angular application that we'll be building to connect with the database. Alright, so I want to head over to my document folder and I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it Angular Demo, and we'll be creating the new Angular application in here. We'll be using the Angular CLI to do that. The Angular CLI makes it easy to bootstrap a new Angular application. So I'm just going to open that folder in the terminal right here, and as you can see, I've installed the Angular CLI. To install the Angular CLI, you need to install Node, and right here you can see that I've installed Node. If I just check the version real quick, you see I have Node 14 installed. You can really install Node from their website. It's very easy, and also you want to make sure that you have npm install. So when you install Node, it comes with the Node package manager, which is npm, and you want to use that to install Angular. We give you the ng command. So if I do ng version right here, you're going to see that I've installed the Angular CLI. So we'll be bootstrapping our application using the Angular CLI real quick. Just going to clear the console, and to do that you want to type ng new with the name of your application, and I'm going to call mine players app. And now it's asking me if I want to check strict typing. I'm going to say yes. If I want to add Angular routing, I'm going to say yes, and we're going to be using CSS. So that's how easy it is to set up an Angular application using the Angular CLI. Before that, you have to go to the repository to download all the files and set it up. But with Angular CLI, it's really easy to create a new project, generate components, generate services, which is really useful as an Angular developer. Alright, our project is generated and I want to check it. You see we have the players app in there, so I'm just going to cd into the players app, and I would open it on Visual Studio Code. So I'll be using Visual Studio Code as my editor. You can follow along if you have Visual Studio, or you can use whichever editor that you prefer. So let me just open this in full screen, and you can see we have the Angular app that generated here for us. So next thing I want to do is I want to install Bootstrap, because Bootstrap is what we'll be using to style our Angular application. So I'm just going to open the command terminal and I want to install Bootstrap. I can do that with npm. So I say npm install I, and I just want to type Bootstrap. Okay, and I want to do -- save, so it saves it as the dependency. Now Bootstrap is installed. Okay, my npm needs to be updated. I can do that later. I just want to clear the console, and now we want to add Bootstrap to our project. So if I go to the node modules and I scroll down, you're going to see that we have Bootstrap right here. And if you open it, you're going to see the location, dist, CSS, and there you have the Bootstrap, the CSS file, which we would be adding to our project. So let's do that real quick. So if I go to styles.css, I can add the Bootstrap here, or I can also do it on the angular.json file, and I can import the Bootstrap styles here, and also the Bootstrap JavaScript or any other package I want to add. But since it's a small project, I'll be doing it in the style.css file. So I'm just going to type import, and then I want to open the code, and I want to put a tilde, a bootstrap, okay, /dist, bootstrap /this /css, and inside the css folder we have bootstrap.css. So let's check that real quick to make sure we have the correct folder. So we have bootstrap, and in there we have dist, we have css, and then we have bootstrap.css. All right, that's how you can find the path to the folder and make sure you've gotten it right. So I'm just going to close the node module, and now we want to set up our routing. So I'm going to generate some components with the CLI that I'll be using, and set up the routing with that. All right, so to generate the component, I'm going to do ng, G for generate, C for component. I'm going to put it in the components folder, and the first component I want to generate is nav, because I'll be using a Bootstrap navigation, and I want to do -- skip test, so I don't have any unit test with the component. So I'm going to hit enter, and if you go to the app component, you see that we have the component for the nav. I'm going to generate another one for the players, so I'm just going to go back and do another one for players and hit enter, and I'll generate one more for the players form. So I'm going to do player form. Okay, I hit enter. So that's it. We have our three components that would hold our application. So we have the three components, and we want to use this component to set the route. So in order for us to set the routes, I need to go to the app.routing module. So if we go to app.routing right here, we can see that we can set the routes here. Angular generated that for us, so it's easy to set the routes. So I want to enter path, and I want to set this for the default paths, just leave it as empty. And next, the component for the default, I want to say players component. Okay, the next route I want to set is the route for adding a new player. So that would be, let's say, player /new, and this would add a new player, right? So the component for that is our players form. So our player form will be used to add the new component. And next, we also need one component to edit the player. So I'm going to give the path for that. Let's say path, and this would be player slash, then I want to put the ID there, and let's still make this go to the players form component, because we'll be displaying the single player in the player form so we can edit it. All right, looks like our route looks good. So the next thing we want to do is we want to set up that navigation from Bootstrap. So real quick, we want to go into Bootstrap website. So if I head over to getbootstrap.com, and I go to examples, you see different examples that we have here. I just need the navigation, so let's look for one with a nice navigation bar. So let's see this. Okay, we have all the nav bars here, right? So I'm just going to click this nav bar, and if I right click on it and go to view page source, I can see the nav bar here. So I'm just going to quickly grab the second one. Let's just grab the second one. I'm going to copy it, and let's head over to our application. And then I want to go to the nav right here, nav component.html, and I want to paste that nav bar here because we'll be using this as our nav bar. I don't want the container to be fluid. That means it's going to start from the beginning. I want it at the middle, so I'm going to remove that fluid. And here we want to add the routes that we just created. So we have one here for home, and we have one here to display the title of the application. So here I'm going to say the title of the application is players app. Okay, and for the link, I'm going to let that redirect to our default page. So I can just put router link with the slash, and that will go to the players component. And I want to do same thing here, router link, and this will go to slash, and the name of that page, I want to call it, let's say players, that list all the players. And finally I need another link here to be able to add a new player, so I'm going to say router link, and this will go to players or player slash new. I think that's what we use for that, and we're going to say add player. All right, I'm going to save this. Next, we want to bring this navigation to our main page and set up the router outlets. So if I close this navigation and I go to app components.html, this is the default HTML that's generated with Angular. I want to delete that, and I want a Bootstrap container, Bootstrap container, and in the container we want to add our navigation. I'm going to do app-nav, and that will bring our navigation. And how I know the name of the directive is app-nav, if you go to the TS, you see that here the name of the selector, it's app-nav. And yeah, the component HTML is the entry point to your application. Next, you want to add the router outlet directive here, so you can be able to navigate through the pages. So I'm going to do router outlet. Okay, so we've done a bit with the application. Let's just quickly run the application and see what it looks like. So I'm going to quickly open another terminal right here, and there I want to serve the application, so I'm going to do ng serve, and this is going to compile our application, and we can see what it looks like. Okay, looks like it compiled fine, and it's running on localhost 4200. Okay, so let's head over there. We want to close this up, and if we go to localhost 4200, you see we have our players nav. And yeah, if I hit on players, add players form works. Okay, the navigation doesn't really look like what I wanted. So let's just go back. First, we want to get rid of the form. Let's go back to our navigation, HTML. We want to get rid of this form because we don't need it. Save that. And if I go back to the component HTML, let's take this out of the container. Let's see if that would remove it from the middle. I save that. I go back. Now the navigation looks like what we were expecting. So if I hit on players, players work. I hit on add players, the forms work. Okay, another thing I noticed is that this text right here is just very close to the navigation. So I just want to give it some padding so it looks nicer. And you can also see the routing at the top. If I hit this is the default one, and if I hit this we get /player/new. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go to um, the application styles.css, sorry, and I'm going to go to the body and just add a padding top, or let's say 50 pixel. And if I save that and I head over, and now this is bringing this down. So actually, you know what, we don't need the padding. Let's just leave the padding out of it and just save it. And this looks good. Let's just work with this. All right, let's go back to our application, and the next thing we want to do is we want to connect the database now to database to our Angular application. And in order for us to do that, we need to bring a library which is called Angular Fire. So Angular Fire allows you to be able to communicate with your Angular application as well as your Firebase application. So let's bring in Angular Fire. To do that, let's just clear this real quick. You want to do ng add at Angular/Fire, and this would bring Angular Fire to our application. But actually, before you do this, you want to make sure that you are logged in to your Firebase application. So if I open a console real quick here and I do Firebase login, you're going to see that I am already logged in here with my Gmail account. So you want to do this first before you try to install Angular Fire. So you want to log in with your Firebase login, and for you to install Firebase globally, you need to run this npm install command Firebase tools, and then you're going to get the Firebase working, and you can log in. And after you log in, you want to head over and install Angular Fire. When you install Angular Fire, it's going to ask you to select what application you want to use to connect to with your Angular application. So I only have one here, so I'm going to choose the Players app. And there it's created. So that's all you need to do. You install Firebase globally, and then you install Angular Fire. Now, next thing I want to do is I want to head over to my Firebase app and copy out some properties. And if I go project settings, you can see we can connect our Firebase application to different applications. You can use iOS app, you can use Android, and you can use web application. So in our case, we'll be using Angular application. So you want to click on this and you want to register your app. I'm going to call my Players app, and then you want to register app, and this would generate some properties that you would need to copy to your app. So these are the properties here that have been generated. You want to copy this and put it in your application. So I'm just going to go back to my application right here, and if I go to the component, I want to go to the environment folder here, and this is where you can put database configuration or server configuration in your Angular app. So you have one for non-production and the other one for production. So here I would just create the Firebase object, Firebase object, and I'm going to paste all those properties in there. Good. So we have the properties in the Firebase object right here. And now we want to bring this in our app module. So I want to go to the app module, and here we want to add in some modules that I'll be using in this application. So we want to add in the Angular Fire module, and you want to do .initialize app, and then you bring in your environment .firebase or .firebase. Right, so you just add Angular Fire, initialize the module, and you bring in your properties from Firebase. Now you can save that, and then that's it. We can use Firebase, but in using Angular to bring in Firebase, you want to do it like the model view controller pattern. So we're going to be creating a service that would allow us to bring the data from Firebase. So let's create a service and a model for that. So I'll clear this up, and I want to generate a service. So to create a new service, I'm going to say ng generate s for service. I want it in the services folder, just like we have our components in the components folder. And we want to call this players or player service, and we don't want any tests, so I'm going to say skip tests. Right. So we generated our service. If you look right here, we have our player service. Next thing, I want us to add a new folder, and let's also do for our models. So models, and here we want to add a new file. Let's call it player.ts. So to store the schema of our player, and you want to do export interface, and our schema is player, and we want to add the different properties for this. So I'm going to say id string to hold the generated id by Firebase, if you remember the document id. Next, we had some properties that we saved. We had the first name, which was also a string. We also had last name, that was also a string. And finally, we have country, that's also a string, and the last field we had was age. So we had all these properties that we want to save to our database. So we're going to create this model for it, and let's head back to our service. And in our service, we want to create a method to get all the players in our database. So I'm going to say get players. I'll call it the method get players, and this will take no parameters, and it's going to return an observable, of player that we just created. We're going to bring in from our model, and it's going to return an observable of array, because we want to get in an array of all our players. So I'm going to add the braces here. And now we want to return, and you can use the Angular. We have to inject the Angular Firestore dependency here to be able to do that. So I'm going to do private Angular Firestore, and this is Angular Firestore with the small s, and we can import it from Angular Fire. Let's import it before the player model. I'm going to do import Angular Firestore, and we want to import it from Angular/Fire/Firestore right here. Okay. So we have our Angular Firestore object. Now let's go back to the get players method, and we want to say this.Angular Firestore. That's how we can use it, and we want to use the collection here. So I'm going to say collection, and you want to give it the name of your collection. We called it players, if you remember. And Now we have two methods that we can use with this. We can use value changes. This is going to return all the players for us, but it's going to return it without the ID. We also want to pass the player object here as a generic parameter. Alright, so this way we can use value changes, and this would return all the players for us. But we also need the ID, because if we are sending the player to the other page, we need the ID to be able to edit the player. So for that, we're going to need snapshot changes. Okay, let me just comment out this one so you can see the difference. So I'm going to do the next one for snapshot changes. So I'm going to say return this dot Angular Fire dot collection. And we want to pass a generic parameter. We're going to say player, and then you want to pass in the players. Okay, and then you want to call snapshot changes. Let's just bring this down. Snapshot changes. And in case of snapshot changes, we want to map that object so we can get the ID and return that. So I'm going to use the pipe operator to map the object, what we get back. And also we want to import that map operator. So I'm going to do import. We want to import the map operator. We want to import it from rxjs /operators here. So now we can use the map operator, and then we're going to get the value. Let's call it changes, and that's going to be of type any. And what we want to do is we want to map this changes operator. This is of type any, so it's of type any, and we want to map that to changes, and we can map it this way. Say dot map, then we map it with a value, let's say C, and this is any, and we want to map that to an array. So here it's going to bring this down, and we want to map this to an array. I'm going to do this, and we have an object here. I have two dots here, so I'm just going to take that away. Good. So we have an object here, and first we want to get the ID. That's why we're mapping in the first place, and we're going to do it by saying c.payload dot, in the payload we have the document, and in the document we have the ID, and here we want to use the spread operator to add the data to. So I'm going to say that the c dot payload dot doc dot data. All right, so this is how we can do it with snapshot changes. You see, this is more complex than the value changes. That's easier, but the only difference is that with the snapshot changes you can get the ID, and the ID is useful when you want to edit, and we plan to do edit in this application, so we need the ID. So this is how you do it. You do it with snapshot changes if you need the ID, otherwise you do it with value changes. All right, so let's just add a semicolon here, and we are done with this get players method. Now let's test it and see what it gives back in our component. So we can test that in our players component. I'll just quickly go to the TS file, and here we want to inject our service, private player service. Let me just use PS for that. It's always good practice to do this way. Player service. Some people actually put an underscore in front of it to make sure it's a service. So a lot of people with their own convention, you use the one that works for you. I'm going to inject player service right here, and we have this player service, and we want to use that to call our get player method. So I'm going to say this underscore player service dot get players, and this is going to return an observable of an array of player. So we want to subscribe to that observable, and so we give it the value here. Let's call it P for player, and that is a data type of player. Let's bring that from our model. So data type of player array, come on, player array, and then we want to set that P to what we get back. So I'm going to say this dot, we need to initialize the variable here, so let's call that variable player. So players, this will get all our players, and it's a type player array, and let's just initialize this to an empty array. Okay, because our strict checking which we implemented in the beginning. So I'm just going to delete this and put braces so I can have multiple statements in there. So first I want to console.log what we get back. Okay, and then I want to set that to the player. So this dot player equal to P. Okay, so this is how we can get the players from the database. So we can test this real quick, see how it works. Our node is still working. If I go back to the console and I go to our players app, and if I come here we have the player work, and I refresh it and I go to inspect. I'm really having a problem with this navigation, bro. I'm going to get back to it. So you see that we have an array here, and this is what we get from our database. We have the first object here, the age, country. It's ordered by alphabetical order. That's why you have the age first for the country, and the first name and the ID. You see here we get the ID because we are using snapshot changes, but if we change that to value changes, we don't get the ID. Let's just quickly demonstrate that. So if we go back to our services and here, and let's just say we cut this for demonstration, and then we uncomment this. So now we are returning value changes. If I save that and we go back to our application here, you see that we get the same object, but this time around we just get the age, the country, the last name and first name without the ID. So that's the main difference between the value changes and the snapshot changes, that the value changes doesn't bring the ID, but the snapshot changes does. So let's go back to using the snapshot changes. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to display that data that we have. We want to display that data that we have right here. Excuse me. We want to display the data here with our Bootstrap table. So let's quickly do that. Let's say table dot table striped, Okay, that's our bootstrap table. We want to give the head, and in the head we want to add the table head element. In the table head element we have the row before the head element. Beginning to forget HTML semantics. Okay, so we have the head, and here we want to say first name, last name, country, and finally the age. Okay, and then we have the body, so let's say T body, and then we need a row, and then in the row we have the data, so T data, and we can use this by string interpolation. In here we have it as players, so we want to loop through this array of players and display the individual players, and we can do that using the ng4 directive. So I'm going to say ng4 let's say p of players, and here we can do p dot first name, and we can just copy this to and here we have last name, and then we have country, and then we have the age. So if I save that, we have an error that says players does not exist. What is the name? Okay, it's players with the small letter p. So let's use a small letter p, and I'm going to save this, and now we have another error, table element, so we didn't spell our table correctly. Let's save it again, another error, oh my god, and still the table spelling, and hopefully this time there will be no errors. Great, so now we don't have any errors. We go back to our application, and yeah, it's looking more like it. You have the players here, and here we're going to add the player form right here. So this is what it looks like, guys. Here you see now we have the ID because we are using snapshot changes. We are not displaying the ID here, but we are going to have an edit button that when we click on the edit button, it's going to navigate us to the player with the ID. But before we do that, let's see how we can add a player first before we go to edit part, because we're going to use the same form for the add player and the edit player. So next, let's see how we can add this player form. So I'm going to head over back to Visual Studio Code, and we want to add a simple Bootstrap form right here. All right, so we're going to say form. Okay, and it's just going to be a form without an action, but we want to give it a template variable. Let's call it player form. Okay, you can call it whatever you like. We want to set it to ng model, and then we want to use the ng submit event binding to bind to a method to submit the form, and let's call that method, let's call it save, because that's how we'll be saving the form. Okay, so we're going to have an error here because we are using ng model and we haven't we didn't bring in the form module. So let's go back to the app module and bring in the form module. You see, we already have that error after I saved. So we want to go to app.module, and here we can bring in our forms module. So forms module, then S. Okay, after we've done that, we want to go back. Yeah, we still have an error because we haven't created that save method. So if I go back here and I just say save, but the save method should take the parameter of the template variable. So I want to say save and pass in player form. Okay, and then here I want to do save and pass in our player object, but this time we're going to save it as ng form. Come on, ng form object, because it's going to be of that type, so we can check for validation of the form. For now, let's just do console log, and let's do the player dot value. Okay, or you can call it player form, so you know it's not the actual player, and the value is the actual object that's coming out from it. Right, this looks good. Okay, so also in the HTML, we're still having some errors. Expecting one argument but got none, so that's because we haven't saved this. Here we have this in our HTML. If I save this, it's complaining about ng model. Because we didn't import the forms module, which we have done in our app module. Did I save that? All right, ng form value. Okay, we're not using this ng model here. Let's just keep building the form. I'm sure we're going to get rid of the error as we continue coding. So next I want to do a div with form group, not from, form group, and we want an input, or first let's do the label. So we want the label for the first name, and let's call this first name. Next we want, oh, I'm sorry, for the player form you don't pass the ng model. Actually what you need to pass is the ng form. That's why we were getting the error for that. So you need to pass ng model inside the form input element and not the form directive itself. So as you can see, that error is gone. Alright, so here you need to pass in first name, and then we want to create the input for it. So I'm going to say input of type text, and we want to give it a class of form control. Okay, and for the name we want to say first name. Let's also give it ID of first name, and also we can add our ng model here. So ng model, good. We want to copy this because we are lazy, and paste it 4 times because we're going to have 4 fields. One for this first name and not first name, so I'm going to change it to first name. I hope that mistake was just there. And this we want to call it last name, and this one as well. Let's do last name here. And for this one, I'm just going to do Command D and say last name. It's going to change both of them. And here we want to change the country, so I'm going to do Command D. Oops. Sorry, Command D. Oh, that's not first name, so let's change it to first name, and let's do Command D. It gets those one, and we want to call it country. Now it changes everything to country, and we can just change this one to capital C. And let's do the same trick for the last one, first name, and you want to do Command D. It selects everything, and let's change it to age. And there you go, we have all the age. So our form looks good. One more thing we need is a submit button. So let's say we need a button of type submit, and we want to give it a class of btn. Let's just say button of class btn because the default is submit. btn dot btn dash primary. Okay, so we can call this save, and you can also add the type of the button to be submit, and comma, and we just deleted our class. Yeah, good. So we have a button of save, and that's going to call this form. And let's just try to populate our form and see if we get the data. If I go back here, you see we have our form. If I click on the label, it highlights the data there. The only problem that we have right now is that it's too close to our navigation, and that's because we need to add some padding somewhere. And if we had a padding to the nav, let's see if it's going to fix that. So I want to head over to my styles, or actually let's go over to app component. Here we have this app nav, and we want to do for nav class. Let's see if we can do padding. Okay, save that. It doesn't fix it. All right, let's just keep working like that. And the issue was because I copied the wrong navigation. So if I go back to Visual Studio and I go to the navigation, I copied this navigation, the wrong one. And if I go back to getbootstrap.com, let's just quickly fix that navigation. We go to example. Let's copy this one right here. So navigate there, and we need this navigation with the fixed nav bar. So if you inspect that, let's just view page source, and let's copy this navigation. So this fixed bar. Okay, and then let's go back to our page and fix that issue. So on the app component.html, let's get rid of the CSS because we don't need it. We just copied the wrong navigation, and let's add the other navigation bar here. And if I save it and we go back to look at our project, now everything is at the top, but this is good because we know that this is coming from the body. So if I go to styles.css, right here you want to add the padding top. Sorry, you want to do this to the body, so I'm just going to say body and padding top, and you want to give this 80 pixel. And if I save that and I go back to our page, now it's looking good. We have the space that we need. All we need to do is just to fix the link, and it's going to look great again. So I'm just quickly going to do that. Go to the nav component, and you want to remove, first we want to remove this form because we don't need it, and let's remove the disabled as well. And for the link, we're going to call it add player, and it's going to be router link to player/new to add a new form. And for this we want to do a router link, and this is going to go to home, and you can simply copy this and go to here and put it here. And for the nav bar, you want to call it players app. For the home, we want to call it players. Okay, if I save that and I go back to our application, all right, this is much better. This is what we wanted. Functionality still looks good, but it just happened that I copied the wrong navigation, and that was why it was looking that way. So let's go ahead and keep building the functionality for this app. We see we have the form. If I just populate it with some random data and I put save, you see that we have the values displayed here. So we are not passing the ID when we add in a new player, but we're going to pass the ID when we want to edit the player with this same form. All right, so let's go back to our code. The next thing we want to do is we want to save this data here to our database, and we need to create that method in the service. So we can call that method in the service, and it's going to save the data for us. So let's quickly go back to our service and do that. So we go to services, players.service.ts. We have one method here called get players. We want another one, let's call it add players, or add a player, so it's a single player. So let's say one, and this method would not return anything, so let's say void. Okay, and we want to call the Firestore, and then we want to call, so a player is a document. You can do this in two ways. You can say call the document object, and then you can pass in the player data type, and you want to pass in the player it should take a player object. So player object, you get this from the model, and you want to pass that player here. So a document, sorry, you call this method, you pass it not to the document, but you want to pass it to the there's an update and there's an add. So when we're using this document, we're referring to the ID. Sorry, what we need is the collection. So I'm going to say this dot collection, and our collection type is player, and our collection is players. We want to add to this document, and we're going to do dot add. So the other one where you use the document is when you want to do dot get. So this is for dot add. So we're going to pass the player inside. All right, this is how you can do it. And it doesn't return anything. So this, the Angular Firestore collection player, you pass the player and you add in the player inside. All right, let's test this and see if it's going to add our player. Let's test this in our component. So we want to go back to the player form component, the TS file. We have one method for save there, and here we want to get this form player dot value and add it to our database. So we're going to call our service. So let's say this dot, oh, we have to inject the service first, sorry. So I'm going to say private and player service. I'm going to call this player service, and now I can say this dot player service dot add player, and we want to pass the player form dot value. Okay, so that's it. And one thing we want to do, let's just delete this from the console. One thing we want to do after adding the players, we want to route to the other page so we see what we've added. So I'm going to also inject the router. I'm going to do private router. You can separate this on separate lines. So router, and we want to add the import for the router, and after we add the player we want to route to the home page. So I'm going to say this dot router dot navigate, and we want to pass an array with the slash that takes us to the default page. All right, so if I save this, save successfully, I go back to our application. I want to save, let's say we want to save Eden, hazard, country, Belgium, age 27, although it's older. If I do save, we see that we've saved Belgium and the age 27, but we don't see first name and last name, so we have an issue to fix. But we have the first name and everything right here. I think I see something. The first name and the last name is not with camel case, it's with lowercase. I hope that's the problem. So let's go back to the form And yeah, we see the ID is with capital N, but the name is with lower n. So let's update that. And hopefully that should do it. Let's try that again. And if I go back to add player, and let's say favorite goalkeeper Peter Cech, let's use a capital C, and country is Czech Republic. Age is over 40 now. So if I add that, you see we have the name Peter and the last name Czech, and all the values are entered correctly. So we had that error previously because we didn't use the right name with the one that we had in the database, which was using the camel case naming convention and not just last name. All right, so we've seen how we can do the add. We can see how we can read from the database. We can see how we can add with the form. The next thing we want to do, we want to add a button here and redirect to this page and see how we can edit. All right, let's do that really quick. So I'm going to go back to this form right here, and we want to add a link. So I'm going to say this. We want to format it as a button, btn.btn doc. So we have a button, and we want this button to go to, we're going to put a router link right here, and you can do this as we want to go to player. I think we have a link to player, but not /new now, but / the ID, and we can put the ID this way. This is where we need the ID, and the ID would be, oh sorry, we don't need this link here, we need it in the player component. So I'm just going to cut that and take it here, and we need that here. So I'm going to do td and paste that link here, and here I'm just going to do th to give some space there, and you see this is where we need the ID. That's why we did the snapshot changes. So I'm going to put p.id here to get the player ID. And how do we get this ID? We have this ID right here, and in the component we have to get that ID here in the component form. So we want to inject the activated route for that. So I'm going to go back here and inject a route. So private route, and we want to call that activated route. Okay, and let's call that ID here string, and initialize it to an empty string. And for us to get that ID, I'm going to say this.id is equal to this.route dot snapshot dot param map dot get, and we want to get the ID. and this would return a string or null, but we want it to be a string, so I'm just going to say a string. And yeah, this should be good. If I save this, so we are getting the ID here. You can as well put that to the log, console.log. Let's say this dot ID. All right, if I save that and then I go back, I see the button here, but I don't see the value. So I want to go back here, players, HTML, we want to give it the value here. We're going to call it edit. Now I save it and I go back. See, we have our edit button, and when I click it, let's click this one. You see it brings us to this form here, and we have the ID of the player here, and we are also displaying it to the console. So the next thing we want to do is we want to use this ID that we are getting from the other page, and we would use that to search for an individual player so that we can populate this form with that particular player that we've gotten from Firebase. So let's quickly do that. We got this ID here, and we're displaying it in our form component here. So we would need another method to get player, not players, and we will need to pass it this ID. So what I mean is we have our player service, so this dot player service, then we'll create a method. We have add player, get players. We want another one, say get player, or a single player, and we want to pass that player this ID so that it can get the player for us. Okay, it can get the player with this ID, and also we need to we need to update that player, but we can do it here, create it with update. So let's create this method to get the player. So if I go back to our service, here we just want to get this player, so I go to our service, we want to create that method get player. So get player, and this method would return an observable, not player array. This time it's going to return a single player, just a single player, and we want to pass in not to our observable, sorry. So get player, and this is going to get the single player. This is where we can use the doc, so I can say this dot afs dot, you can use the doc here because we want a single player, and you can pass here player, and in the parameter you want to put the address of the player, so you can do players slash, then you want the ID of the player, which we are getting from here. So I'm going to say ID string, getting the ID of the player from here, so you can put that here. So the doc, you get the player slash ID, and here you want to do dot, you can do snapshot, or you can do value changes, but we want to do snapshot since we need the ID like before. So snapshot changes, I'm just going to bring this down, and then like before we want to map the elements, so we're going to bring in the pipe, and then we want to call our map operator, and we want to use a variable, let's call it action this time, and it's going to be of type any. And let's have a code block here, and let's check if that action has a payload, just like we did before. Get this payload, and let's check if the payload exists. If the payload doesn't exist, so if the payload is false, then let's just return an empty object. So if the payload is false, we don't want to edit, but we want to create a new one. So let's just return a new object of type player. Okay, this is having an issue because we need an else block. Else, if it exists, then we want to return the data, which is action dot payload dot data, and we want to return that as our player. Okay, and then we want to get the ID, so I'm going to say data dot ID, so it says player, so we have IntelliSense here. ID would be equal to the action dot the payload dot the ID, and now we want to return data. Hopefully it's going to fix that error. Yep, so it fixed the error, but we have an issue with the observable. We have that imported here. Let's see. Should be observable of player. Oh yes, because we are not having a return statement, so we want to return this. Good, now we don't have any error. Yeah, we had that error with the observable because we are not returning anything. Alright, so this is how you can get the single players. Now I'm using this .doc.player, so that is one way you can do it. Another way you can do it is you can do return this dot afs dot, we can use collection, and we get the collection name, same way we've been doing before, players. And when we get the collection, we want to get the doc and then passing our player ID, which is this ID right here. So we can use the first way or we can use the second way to get the player, whichever one works. So that's how we can get the player, guys. If we go back to the form and try to import that player to our form, so here you see we are calling this get player and it's returning an observable, so we need to subscribe to it, and here we need to define a player of player type, and let's set it to an object of ID empty. What do we have? First name empty, last name empty, country empty, and lastly age, it's empty too. All right, so we have this player object, and then we want to subscribe to that observable we got, and let's just call it P for player, and that will go to this dot player to be equal to P. Okay, so when we get that player, we want to bind whatever we get from that player. We want to bind it to our form so that we can show what we have here in our form. And in order for us to do that, we need to modify this ng model with that player object that we have. A lot of people call this binding, two-way binding, banana in the box. So we are binding to the service and to the data. So we're going to call this player dot, this is for the country, and let me just quickly copy this, paste this here. This is for the age, and I'll do the same here. This is for the first name, and finally this is for last name before first name. So last name, and this is first name. All right, so if I save this and we go back to our application, you see that we get those values here. So if I click on this, you see that we get all the values here, and now we're getting it through the get. I click on edit, we get all that value in the box. That's cool. The next thing we want to do is we want to modify this save button so we can add if we don't have an ID, but if we have an ID coming with it, then we need to update. All right, so the next thing we want to go back to our service, our player service. Now we have something for get players, we have for get the single player, we have add a player. We want to do one for update. So we're going to say update player, and it's going to take a player object and also a player ID. So player ID, which will be a string, and like the other one, it's gonna return a void. Okay, and the same way we can do it this way to use the not the value changes, but we can do it this way to use the document and passing the players with the ID, or we can use it this other way. I really prefer the other way, but here I should add the generic parameter here. I missed that. So the other way to do it, to update, you're going to say this dot afs dot collection, then you want to do what's our collection, players, and we want to call the document, and we want to pass it the ID, which is our player ID, and then we want to call updates, and we want to pass it this player object. That's what we'll be updating. So player. Okay, so that's it. That's how to update. It's really easy to update. And since we are here, let me just quickly create one for the delete because we're going to need one later so we know that our service is completed. So I'm going to say delete player, and this one just needs the ID. So I'm going to say player ID string. So you can use, I'm going to use, and when I use the collection, I just forget to put the generic type most times. And for the delete, I'm going to use the other way. So d.afs.doc, and you put the generic type, which is player, and then you want to pass it the players object and slash, you want to pass the ID that you want to delete. So I'm going to say player ID, and player ID, you want to call the delete method here. So that's it. It doesn't return anything. You can do it this way to delete, which is cool, or you can do the other way. This .afs.collection, and you pass in the player, and then you want to pass in the name of the collection, players, then you want to put the .doc, and then you want to pass the player ID, and then you want to call .delete. So whichever way you like, it works, both of them. So that's how to do the delete, guys. I'm just going to comment out one of it, and let's go ahead and see how we can use the update. So let's go back to our player form.ts. So right here we have this save, and we have this navigate if it saves. So we want to add the player if the ID is equal to new. So when you're creating a new player, a new object in Firebase, it sets the ID to be new because you're adding a new one. And if you are editing or updating, you are going to use the ID that you have gotten from the activated route. So we want to check that with an if statement. So we want to check if our ID, so this dot ID, the one we got with our activated route, we want to check if it is not equal to new. If it's not equal to new, then it has an ID that we can update with. I'm just going to put that in braces. It's not equal to new, and this new is a string, so sorry about that. And else, if it's not new, then you want to if it's not equal to new, you want to add a new player, and otherwise you want to update. So for update, you want to say this dot player service dot update player, and we want to pass it two parameters. The first parameter is the player, which would be player form dot value, and the other one is the player ID, which is the ID that you just checked. So this dot ID. Alright, so if it's not new, you want to update it. Otherwise, if it's new, you want to add a new one. And when you do that, you want to navigate. Okay. Alright, let's see if this works. We have the update now. We go back to this guy, and remember we didn't have Eden and Hazard. And if I update that, I click on save. Now you see that the update works here because we have it here, and it redirected me to the home page that shows all the players after it. And if I click on edit again, I'm going to make it, let's say 29, and then when I click on save, so we're going to have it's edited. Okay, so we are doing the get all, we are doing the get a single, we are doing the save, and next we want to do the final operation, which is our delete. We already created the service for that, so we just need to create a link and wire up to that function. So we want to create a delete. So delete, delete, take any, should it take any parameter? No, it's just a delete because we have the ID that we want to delete. So I'm just going to say this dot player service dot, we have delete player, and delete player take one parameter, which is the player ID. You want to pass this dot ID, and that doesn't return anything. So that's it. That's how to delete. Very easy. But we want to put this in a confirm box so that when we click it, it's going to give us a JavaScript confirmation box. So I'm going to say if confirm, and inside that I'm going to put the message, are you sure you want to delete, with the question mark, and if we are sure, with the if, then we can delete. I'm going to paste this here, and once we have deleted, we want to navigate back to the home page. So I'm going to do this dot router dot navigate, and inside there we want to just put in the default page. Okay, we set up the delete method. Now let's go back to our HTML. We have this button here, and we want to add a link, a dot, we want to put the button btn danger. Okay, we don't need href, instead we need the router link. And where is this going to go? It's going to go to instead of using router link, we can just bind it to that delete event that we created. So I'm going to do click, or when we click it, and we're going to call that delete method. All right, and our name is going to be delete here. So if I save that, that looks good. We go back to, you see that we have this delete right here, and if I hit on delete, we want to delete the header, and it says, are you sure you want to delete? And I click OK, and you see that player is gone. It's get removed from our database. So there's still one issue that we need to fix. If I click on add player, you see we have an error here. Cannot be called with an empty path. Okay, you know what? I'm going to pause the video and try to fix the issue and come back. Alright guys, so I found a few errors that we had in our project. I just corrected them and I wanted to share it with you. The first one is here we were declaring the age here. We initialized it as an empty string, but when we created our Firestore project, we defined the age to be of number type. So I just initialized this here to be 0. But before that, I went into the models component, the player.ts, and I changed this from string to number. So that's one mistake that we made. So this was number. And another issue that I just fixed was the save method right here. If it takes this ID is not equal to new, actually it's equal to null. So if this is null, then we want to If this is not null, then we want to update the player and if this has an ID, we want to add a new player. So I set the initialize the ID to an empty string, and in the HTML here, I'm hiding that delete button by checking, and if the ID is null, then we don't want to show the delete because we are adding a new field. So when it's null, we are adding a new field, and otherwise we are not adding a new field. So here in this save, it's not null, so we are getting a value here and we are updating a player because we are getting that value from our activated route. So that's it, guys. That's what the changes I made. I'm just going to delete all this console.log because that's what I used in um, finding out the errors. So if I go back to the application now, and you're going to see that for the player, if I click on edit, you see we have the save as well as the delete. I can edit it now. The edit was working before. The issue was with the delete was working as well. The issue was when we add this new player and we get that error, and that's because we need to check here if this value is not null. So if it's not null, if it's null, then we don't want to get this ID here. That's when we are creating a new one. So we just want to check. So what I did was I just check with this if statement on this ID here, and then I'm using that to get this value right here. Alright, so that's it, guys. We have a full CRUD functionality. We can add a new player. Let's just quickly add one, Joan Mata, and Spain, and he's 26. So we can add, we can edit. I can change his name to 27, and also we can delete. So we have the full CRUD functionality, and we are almost done with this project. The things that is left for me to add, I want to add the Angular flash message. So when I save or delete, I get a flash message that tells me that the data has been added or is being deleted. And another thing, I want to make this field number, this input to be number and not the text. So let's quickly do that. So let's start with the easy one. So this age, we want to make this number, not text. So number, and if I save that and we go back, and you see this is number, I can increase or I can delete. The next thing that we want to do is we want to bring in Angular flash message so that we can display some flash messages. So if I type on Google and go to Angular flash message right here, you can see flash messages Angular npm. And the way we can bring it to our project, we do npm install flash message. So I'm just going to copy that and go back to our project. Just going to increase this a bit, and let's install flash messages. Let me just clear this, and I want to paste that in npm I install flash messages Angular, and I want to do dash dash save. Okay, so you want to bring in those flash message, and after installing, which it's completed now, you want to go over to your app.routing, not routing, app.module folder, and here in your app.module you want to bring in your flash message. So I just say Angular flash, sorry, I think it's flash message module. So you want to bring your flash message module dot for root. Okay, you want to bring that to your import, and that's coming from flash messages dash angular. So I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to go to my app component. If I go to app component.html, I want to add the flash messages here before my router outlet. So I'm going to say flash message. Okay, I'm going to bring it like so, and in whatever component that we want to use it, you want to bring it in as a service. So if I go to my player form component, I want to bring in the flash message module as a service. So I'm going to do private flash. Let's do the same way. So I'm going to say flash message, and I want to bring it from the flash message module, not module, sorry, flash message service. Flash messages service. Okay, so you bring the module in your app.module and the service in the component where you want to import it. Okay, you bring flash service, and after we save the player, we can add here the add player. We can say this dot flash message dot, you want to call the show method, and then you want to give it whatever message you want. So let's say a new player has been added, and you want to give him the second parameter, which is an object that takes in the CSS class. And for the CSS class, you can use alert and alert dot success, and then you want to give it a timeout. So set timeout, not that one, sorry, set timeout, and let's set that to 4000. Set that to 4000 milliseconds. Okay, I want to show this message when a player has been added, and I want to show a similar message when the player has been updated. So let's say I'm going to do this if a player has been updated. So I'm going to say player updated, but for my class, CSS class, I'm going to use primary alert.primary or dash primary, sorry. Alright, so let's do one for delete as well. So for delete, we want to do this dot flash message dot show, and let's say player has been deleted, and then we want to pass in an object that takes CSS class, of alert, and alert, let's use danger for red, and for the timeout we want to do set timeout. Let's do 5000 here. Okay, so we have one for delete, one for update, and one for add. Okay, let's save that and check our node. It's flash message or flash messages. So I think it's flash messages. if I go back to the HTML, let's say flash messages, save that. Yes, it's flash messages, we don't have any error. So if I go back, and just to show you, you want to bring it like this, flash messages there. So if you go back to here, and let's say we want to edit his age to 45, if I save, you see we get the flash message that say player has been updated. If we add a new one, let's say Juan Mata again, country Spain, and age 34, and we say save, you see player has been added. And if I want to delete, edit, and I go to delete, you sure you want to delete, okay, you see with the red one, player has been deleted. All right guys, so we are almost there. The final thing that we need to take care of is validation. So if I click here and I don't enter any value, you see I don't get any errors. So let's quickly see how we can do validation. So quickly, we're going to go to our components. We're going to go to player form component. In the HTML here, we are passing this player form parameter, and in the save method here, we're checking if this ID, and we're doing all this. So let's check first to make sure that our form is valid. So if I say if the player form is, let's actually check. If it's not valid, we want to give some error, else we want to do all this if it's valid. So I'm going to copy all what we have in this first if, as well as the navigation, and I'm going to paste that here. So we want to do this if this is valid. So if this is not valid, let's show a message. So I'm going to do flash message, say this dot flash message dot show. Then I'm going to add, there are some errors with the form, not from form, and I want to pass a second parameter, which is an object of CSS class, and this would be alert danger, and then the last one would be a timeout, set timeout actually, and let's set for 5,000. Okay, so let's check this to see if it works. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go there, and now we didn't enter anything. Let's try to save it. Wow, that's not right. Okay, if it's not valid, Okay, let me just quickly do a very let's console and see. And see what we get here. I'm just going to save it. And let's go add player, save. New player has been added. So valid is true, but that's not valid. I guess yes, because we haven't added anything to our errors. We did not add any validation. So if we go to our form, now let's put the validation here. So I'm going to check for just required for all the fields. So I'm going to say required for country as well, required, and for age as well. I want to check required. Okay, we have that there. And if I save it now, and if we try to save, you see now there are some errors with the form because now we added validation that it's false and it's required. All right, so we can get rid of our console statement. Console.log, it's the best for debugging. So yeah, you want to check that, and if it's not valid, you want to show that message, else you want to do this. Now the last thing we want to do is we want to do the validation on this side. So we have the required field here, and also we need a template variable for each of the field. I'm going to call this one first name input, and I'm going to set it to ng model. Nice. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to check bind that to ng class. So let's say ng class, and bind that to, there's a class from Bootstrap that says it's invalid. So this class gives a red border if you have an error, so it's invalid, and you want to bind that class to our template variable, which is first name input. That one we want to check if it's invalid. If it's invalid, and if it has been touched. So first name input does touched, if it has been touched, or if it's invalid, so touched. So let's save that. What there's it. So I have this. First name input does not exist. Did I spell it right? Just going to copy it to make sure I spelled it right. It's the other one, so this one. Just paste it there. Looks good. I'm going to stop it, try to debug it. Okay, I see the mistake here. That's because of a typo here, and I didn't spell the first correctly. So I'm just going to change it. It's first and not feast. So first name input, I'm going to save that. and just going to change it right here because I had a typo with that as well. And if I save, it should be good now. And when I go back to the browser, first name, I leave it without writing anything. You see this border here, and also you can, so that red border is coming from this is invalid class from Bootstrap, and you can also display a message there to tell the user that what's wrong with that input. So I'm going to give a div here, or I just put the class, which is called invalid feedback, and we have the div there, and there you want to type your message. Let's say first name is required. Okay, and then you want to hide this, so we're going to say hidden, and we only show this if there are no errors with, if we have errors with the input. So first name input, hopefully we typed it right this time, dot errors dot required. Okay, so we typed it right this time. Hopefully if I saved it and I go back to this and I don't enter anything, and there you see the border and you see the message saying first name is required. So we're going to do the same for the last name, country, and age, and we can just, for the input, I'm going to say last name input, and I'm going to set it to ng model, and then I'm just going to break this down, and I'm going to copy this div right here, and after that I'm going to paste this, and here we are using last name input, and here you want to say last name is required, and of course we need our ng class, so I'm going to bring that here. So I'm going to change first with Command D and change it to last. Okay, we have that for last name. We want to do the same thing for, we want to do the same thing for the country, so I'm going to paste it here, and this is going to be country is required, and let's call this country input, and I'm just going to copy this country input, and here I'm going to give the template variable name country input equal ng model. And next thing we want to bring is we want to bring in our ng class here, and you can also use it with class binding. Just do class dot is invalid and set it to this, whichever way works for you. So going to do Command D and call this country, country input dot touched, and we need the last one for the age, so let's say age input, and this is going to be ng model, and here we want to add the ng class, and here command D age input, and next we want to display the errors. So I'm going to paste this here and say age is required, and command D, let's choose this one, so age. Alright, so I have age here, age is required. Okay, now let's test this and see if we fixed it for all of them. Alright, so here the first name, I don't enter anything. First name required, last name required, country is required, and I don't see any message for the age. Let's check that. Or probably that's because we have 0 by default for the age. So that's why if I delete that 0, you see the age is required. And if I type to submit, you see that there are some errors with the form. All right. So that's it, guys. I can delete this. I can do the delete. I can add a new player. Let's quickly add one. Run matter, Spain, and if I say 34, I can add a new one. I can edit his age, 35. I can save, and I can do delete. So if I try to delete that, that's gone. And just to be sure we have everything in our database, if I come back to check the Firestore, you see we have the remaining item, which is Hakim Ziyech and Frank Lampard that we started with right here. So that's it, guys. That's how you can create a simple CRUD application implementing validation and Bootstrap with Angular and Firebase. I hope you've enjoyed this video and you've learned one or two things from it. If you like this video, just give it a thumbs up for me. Thank you, and